I am Julianne Vance, and at 36 years old, I sat down for our family's most triumphant Thanksgiving dinner. My father proudly announced the $250 million sale of our medical company, a deal built on the groundbreaking cure we had developed. Then, in front of everyone, he looked directly at me and said, I would inherit nothing. He told me, "You are just a scientist. This legacy is mine." He thought he was selling my future, but he did not know the company's value came from my mother's stolen research. And I was the only one with the proof. The air in the Addams family dining room was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and unspoken resentments. Our massive mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the cold November light filtering through the bay windows. Every year, my mother insisted on using the wedding china and the sterling silver, a performance of family unity that felt more hollow with each passing Thanksgiving. I watched my father, Harrison Vance, at the head of the table. He was in his element, a king presiding over his court, his voice booming as he recounted a recent business victory to my uncle. My older brother Carter sat to his right, a carbon copy of our father in a more expensive suit. He smirked, adding a financial detail here and there, making sure everyone knew his role in the company's success. He was the chief financial officer, the deal maker. I was just the scientist, the head of R&D, the person whose work they were actually selling. I kept my expression neutral, slowly swirling the wine in my glass, feeling like a ghost at my own feast. The most prominent guest, as always, was the one who was not there. The empty chair beside me belonged to my mother, Eleanor. She had been gone for years, but my father never failed to invoke her memory when it served him. He raised his glass early in the meal for a toast. To Eleanor, he said, his voice laced with practiced sorrow. She would be so proud to see what her vision has become, what this family has built in her honor. I felt a familiar bitter taste rise in my throat. He spoke of her vision, but he had locked her research, her real legacy, away in his office, safe, calling it a sacred memento. I knew better. To my father, everything had a price, even grief. The meal was an exercise in endurance. Carter bragged about the valuation multiples he had negotiated using industry terms that he barely understood. My father nodded along, basking in the reflected glory, occasionally glancing my way as if to confirm I was still there, still silent, still playing my part as the quiet, intellectual daughter who did not concern herself with the messy business of money. He had no idea I could dissect his financial reports more accurately than Carter ever could. I let them talk. My silence had become a shield over the years, a place where I could observe and calculate without being noticed. But today, the shield felt thin, brittle. I could feel the pressure building, the low hum of an impending earthquake just beneath the floorboards. Finally, as dessert was being served, it happened. My father gently tapped his crystal water glass with a knife. The sharp, clear ping cut through the chatter, and the room fell silent. He stood up, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. He surveyed the room, his family letting the moment hang in the air. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice full of a gravity he reserved for moments he considered historic. "One that will change the future of this family and the legacy of Vance Medical Solutions forever." I set my fork down my hand, steady my heart, a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I knew with absolute certainty the moment I had dreaded for an entire decade had finally arrived. The silence that followed my father's statement was heavy, expectant. He had always been a master of theatrics, and this was clearly his grand finale. He paused, making eye contact with each person at the table, savoring his power before delivering the news. "As you all know," he began, "I have dedicated the last 20 years to building this company. From the groundbreaking research my dear Eleanor started to the global enterprise it is today." His gaze lingered for a moment on my mother's empty chair, a calculated move that always won him sympathy. "I have received an offer to sell Vance Medical Solutions," he continued. "An offer that recognizes the immense value we have created. The buyer is one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations in the world. The deal is for $250 million. A collective gasp went through the room. My aunt dropped her fork with a clatter. Carter's face split into a wide, predatory grin. He raised his glass to my father, who acknowledged him with a proud nod. This was their victory, their shared triumph. I remained perfectly still, a spectator watching a play I had read the script for long ago. The sale, my father added, is contingent on final FDA approval for our new flagship drug, a revolutionary therapy that will change how we treat autoimmune diseases. It is a formality at this point. Our data is flawless. My data, I thought. My years in the lab, my sleepless nights, my relentless pursuit of the science. The therapy was my life's work, a continuation of the theoretical research my mother had pioneered. The room erupted into congratulations and excited chatter. Questions flew about the sale, about retirement plans, about the sheer scale of the money involved. Through it all, I said nothing. My mind drifted back to a conversation years earlier, shortly after my mother passed away. I had found my father in his study going through her research journals. I had asked if I could keep them, wanting to preserve her scientific mind, her handwriting, her legacy. He had refused. "These are too valuable, Julianne," he had told me, locking them in his heavy mahogany safe. "They are the heart of this company. They are a sacred memento." At the time, I thought he was being sentimental protective. Now I understood. He was not protecting a memory. He was securing an asset. He had claimed her legacy as his own, just as he was now claiming mine. He called it a memento, but I knew even then that to my father everything was a commodity. Everything was for sale. My father's performance reminded me of an interview he gave 2 years ago. A journalist from a major business publication had come to our headquarters to write a profile on him, the visionary CEO leading a company on the brink of a medical breakthrough. They sat in the main conference room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Diego coastline. I was required to be there, the silent scientist, a prop to lend credibility to his narrative. He spoke at length about my mother, his voice thick with emotion as he recounted her battle with the illness that took her. He told the reporter he had promised her in her final days that her work would not die with her, that he would build a legacy in her name. It was a masterful performance. The journalist was captivated, scribbling notes furiously, completely buying into the story of the grieving husband turned crusader. After the interview, as we walked back to his office, Carter fell into step beside me. He had been watching from the back of the room, a smirk on his face the entire time. He caught me looking at him and just shrugged. "Emotion sells jewels. You should know that." He said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it chilled me to the bone. It was not just cynicism. It was the operating principle of our family. That conversation was what finally pushed me to act on a suspicion that had been gnawing at me for years. A week later, I stayed late at the office long after everyone else had gone home. With trembling hands, I used my master key to open my father's study. I went to the safe, the one he claimed held only sacred mementos, and used the override code my mother had given me in case of emergency long ago. Inside, beneath piles of financial documents, were her journals. I did not have much time. I took the final 2 notebooks, the ones detailing her most advanced and unfinished theoretical work. My hands shook as I carried them to the high-speed copier in the admin wing. The hum of the machine sounded like a jet engine in the silent building. I carefully copied the last 30 pages, the ones filled with complex molecular diagrams and speculative equations that no one else in the company, not even me at the time, fully understood. A deep, unsettling feeling had told me I needed a record of her true genius, a copy of her mind that my father could not lock away or sell. I put the original journals back in the safe, locked it, and left his office as if I had never been there. The copied pages had been hidden in a secure location ever since. My brother was right. Emotion sells, and my father was about to sell my mother's story, her legacy, and my life's work, all for $250 million. The memory of the cold, humming copier faded as my father's voice pulled me back to the present. He held his glass aloft, the very picture of a benevolent patriarch. After months of intense negotiations, he announced we have finalized the sale of Vance Medical Solutions. The price, $250 million, is a testament to the legacy we have built. The entire deal, of course, is pending the final FDA approval of our new therapy, which we expect any day now. A wave of applause and excited murmurs swept through the room. My father beamed, letting the praise wash over him. He placed a hand on Carter's shoulder. "I could not have done it without my son, my right hand. He is a lion in the boardroom." Carter puffed out his chest, accepting congratulations from our uncles and cousins. He was the hero of the hour, the son who had brought home the prize. No one looked at me. It was as if I were invisible, a piece of the furniture. My years of research, the countless 17-hour days in the lab, the breakthroughs that formed the very foundation of the drug they were selling, none of it mattered. In their story, I was a footnote at best. I felt a strange sense of detachment watching the scene unfold from a great distance. I saw my aunts calculating their share of the family trust, my cousins already planning how to spend their inheritance. I saw my mother give my father a proud, loving look, a look that ignored the daughter sitting right next to her. This was the family business. It was a business of erasing my contributions, of minimizing my worth, of pretending I was merely a helper in the grand narrative written by the men in my family. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The liquid was cool and sharp, a stark contrast to the burning anger coiled in my stomach. I had known this day would come. I had prepared for it, but knowing did not make the reality any less painful. It was the public nature of the erasure that stung the most. To be rendered insignificant in front of the very people who had watched me grow up, who knew how hard I had worked. My father waited for the applause to die down. He held up a hand for silence, his expression turning serious again. "There is one final piece of business to discuss," he said, "a matter that affects the children directly." The room quieted once more, a new kind of anticipation filling the air. Carter leaned forward, a greedy light in his eyes. And then my father's gaze finally landed on me, pinning me to my chair from across the long, polished table. "Regarding the matter of the inheritance." My father let the words hang in the air, a master of suspense. He cleared his throat, ensuring he had everyone's complete and undivided attention. "Carter will, of course, receive a significant portion of the proceeds," he began, his voice firm and decisive. "His contributions as CFO and his leadership during the sale have been invaluable. He is the future of the Vance name in the business world." He gave Carter a paternal nod, a king anointing his heir. Carter sat back looking smug, as if this was nothing more than his natural due. "My mother and I will be well taken care of," my father continued, "setting ourselves up for a comfortable retirement." A small murmur of approval went through the room. It all sounded so reasonable, so traditional. But then he turned his full attention back to me. His eyes, the same deep blue as my own, were cold, dismissive. As for Julianne, he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming almost patronizing. "She has her career, her passion. Her reward is in the science, not in the finance." The room grew quiet. I could feel the uncomfortable shifting of my relatives in their chairs. They did not understand what was happening, but they could sense the tension. I, however, understood perfectly. This was it, the final public declaration of my worth in his eyes. My father took a breath and delivered the final blow, the line he had clearly rehearsed. "You are just a scientist, Julianne. You do not understand money. This legacy is mine, and so you will inherit nothing from this sale." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a second of my public humiliation. No one spoke. No one defended me. My mother looked down at her plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the china. Carter avoided my gaze, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. The rest of my family just stared, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. They were witnessing an execution, and no one dared to intervene. The words themselves were not a surprise. I had expected them. But the delivery, the coldness, the finality of it in front of everyone I knew, it was a special kind of cruelty. It was designed to break me, to put me in my place once and for all. But as I sat there under the weight of their collective gaze, I did not feel broken. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The pain was there, a deep, familiar ache. But beneath it, something else was solidifying. Something hard and unyielding. The slap did not hurt. It was the look in his eyes as he claimed my mother's legacy, her memory, her very soul as his own. That was the thing that froze my heart. I do not remember how the dinner ended. It is a blur of polite excuses and averted gazes. I vaguely recall my aunt patting my arm with a look of deep pity, a gesture that felt more insulting than comforting. I managed to excuse myself, my voice sounding distant and unfamiliar even to my own ears. I retreated to my old childhood bedroom, the one my parents had kept exactly as I had left it, a pale pink museum of a girl who no longer existed. I closed the door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the silent house, and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to breathe. The room was filled with the ghosts of my past. Debate trophies and science fair ribbons lined the shelves, relics of a time when I believed merit and hard work were all that mattered. I had spent countless nights at the desk in the corner, fueled by coffee and ambition, dreaming of the day I would make a discovery that would make my family proud. The irony was suffocating. I had made the discovery. I had created the very thing that was now tearing my family apart, or more accurately, revealing what it had always been. From downstairs, the muffled sounds of celebration began to drift up through the floorboards. The initial shock of my disinheritance had clearly worn off, replaced by the intoxicating allure of $250 million. I could hear my father's booming laugh, the sound of champagne corks popping, the shrill, excited chatter of my relatives. They were celebrating my erasure. They were toasting to a future built on my work, a future I was explicitly excluded from. Then I heard my brother's voice, louder than the rest, full of arrogance and scotch. "Do not worry about Julianne," he was saying to someone, his words slurring slightly. "She will be fine. She has her little lab. Besides, once the deal is closed and the money is in our accounts, we will figure out how to handle her." The phrase hung in the air, cold and menacing. Handle me. I was not a daughter or a sister anymore. I was a problem to be managed, an asset to be controlled, a loose end to be tied up. That was the moment the last of my illusions shattered. This was not just about my father's ego or my brother's greed. This was a calculated removal. They were not just taking my inheritance. They were planning to take my power, my voice, and ultimately, my work. They were not dancing on my future. They were dancing on my mother's grave, and in the quiet of my childhood room, surrounded by the ghosts of my own ambition, I knew I could not let that happen. The sounds of their laughter felt like an assault. I could not stay in that room, surrounded by the trophies of a life they had just declared meaningless. I needed air. I needed distance. On instinct, I walked down the hall past the guest rooms and the linen closet to the room at the very end. It had once been my mother's study, a sanctuary filled with books, scientific journals, and the faint, sharp scent of old paper and coffee. Now it was a bland, impersonal guest room, stripped of all her personality. My father had seen to that, erasing her intellectual presence almost as soon as she was gone. But he had missed one thing. Tucked away in the back of the closet behind a stack of spare blankets was a small wooden box. It was where she kept things that mattered to her outside of science. Old photographs, my first baby tooth, a dried flower from their wedding day. I had not opened it in years. I sat on the floor, the muffled sounds of the party, a distant hum, and lifted the lid. The familiar scent of cedar and memories filled the air. I sifted through the contents, my fingers tracing the edges of photographs of a younger, happier family. And then I saw it. At the very bottom, beneath everything else, was an envelope. My name was written on the front in my mother's elegant, precise handwriting. It was sealed. I had never seen it before. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was dated just 2 months before she died. "My dearest Julianne," she had written. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I did not have the strength to tell you this in person. I am so proud of the scientist you are becoming, but I need to warn you. Your father is a good man in many ways, but his ambition can be a blinding force. He sees the world in terms of assets and legacy, and sometimes he forgets the human cost. He is starting to see my work, our work, not as a gift to the world, but as a product to be owned. I beg you, do not let his ambition corrupt the science. Protect our truth." I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. The pain I had been feeling all night, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all coalesced into a single sharp point of focus. This was not just about my inheritance. This was not just about my career. This was about a promise, a duty. My mother had seen this coming. She had known what my father was capable of, and she had trusted me to be the guardian of her legacy of our shared truth. The last sentence echoed in my mind a call to arms from beyond the grave. That letter was not a warning. It was a command. I folded my mother's letter, the fragile paper a source of impossible strength, and placed it back in the box. The sounds of celebration from downstairs no longer felt like an insult. They sounded like a countdown. The party, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it was all temporary. I walked out of the quiet guest room and back to my own, closing the door with a soft, final click. There was no more room for tears or anger. Grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. Now there was only the mission. I sat at my old desk, the same one where I had first sketched out the molecular structures that would become their fortune, and pulled out my phone. I made one call, to my lawyer, Mark. He specialized in intellectual property, a quiet, brilliant man I had put on retainer 5 years ago for this exact contingency. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and professional, even late on Thanksgiving evening. "Mark, it is Julianne. It is happening," I said, my own voice steady, devoid of emotion. There was a pause on the other end, not of surprise, but of understanding. "Contingency Plan Alpha," he said simply. "I will start assembling the documents now. We will be ready to file by morning." "Good," I replied. "I will forward you the final piece of evidence within the hour." After I hung up, I opened my laptop. The sounds from downstairs faded into white noise as I focused. I logged into a heavily encrypted secure cloud server, a digital vault I had built myself. Inside were years of my work meticulously documented. Every patent application for the therapy, all of which listed me as the lead inventor. Every submission to the FDA, every clinical trial data set, every email chain where my father and brother dismissed my concerns about rushing the process. It was all there. And then I opened the most important file. The scanned high-resolution copies of the final 30 pages of my mother's research journal. I cross-referenced her theoretical equations with our final approved chemical compound. The link was undeniable, a direct line of intellectual inheritance that my father had deliberately buried. He had built his legacy on her genius, then tried to sell it using mine. A cold, precise strategy formed in my mind, each step clicking into place like a complex molecular chain. This was not a family dispute anymore. It was a scientific and legal war. And I had just armed myself with the truth. I sent the encrypted file to my lawyer and closed the laptop. The quiet click of the machine shutting down was a period at the end of a long, painful chapter of my life. A new one was about to begin. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. There was no hesitation in my steps as I walked to the door. My spine was straight, my shoulders back. The heartbroken daughter who had fled the dinner table an hour ago was gone. In her place was the CEO of a plan that had been 10 years in the making. I descended the grand staircase, each step deliberate and silent. The sounds of the party grew louder, a wave of oblivious celebration. Carter was holding court by the fireplace, regaling our cousins with an exaggerated story of the negotiation. My father was accepting backslaps from my uncles, his face flushed with victory and champagne. The air was thick with self-congratulation. They were so lost in their triumph that no one noticed me at first. I walked directly to the bar cart, my movements calm and measured. The conversation began to falter as people turned one by one, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. I ignored their curious, confused stares. I picked up a heavy crystal tumbler and filled it with ice water from a pitcher. The clinking of the ice cubes against the glass was the only sound in the now silent room. I took a slow sip, my eyes scanning the faces of my family. I saw shock then, unease, then a dawning awareness that something was terribly wrong. I walked to the massive dining table now cleared of everything except the festive centerpiece. I set my glass down with a soft, definitive click. Then I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out the folded, time-worn letter from my mother. I placed it in the center of the table, a fragile piece of paper that held the weight of an entire legacy. It lay there between us, an indictment. My father finally found his voice, a nervous bluster replacing his earlier confidence. Julianne, what is the meaning of this? I did not look at him. I looked at the letter. Then I looked at Carter. Finally, my eyes met my father's. Dad, I said, my voice perfectly level, utterly calm. Before you and Carter pop that bottle of champagne, we need to have a little talk. About who really created this cure? My father's face tightened. He took a step forward, his voice a low growl. What are you talking about? We all know who created this cure. It was a company effort led by me. He glanced around the room, seeking validation from the stunned faces of our relatives. He was reasserting his narrative, the one he had sold to the world for years. I did not flinch. I let his words hang in the air, heavy with their own falsehood. I am glad you brought up the company effort, I said, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. Because I have a question for you and Carter, who is listed as the lead inventor on all 7 of the core patents for this therapy. Carter shifted his weight, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He knew the answer, but he also knew it was not the answer our father wanted to hear. Do not be ridiculous, Julianne, my father snapped, stepping in before Carter could speak. Those are just legal formalities. Your name is on them because you were the head of the lab. That is all. Is that all? I repeated softly. I looked around at my family. Do you all hear that? According to the CEO, the patents that form the entire $250 million valuation of his company are just a formality. The legal documents that grant ownership and control over the most valuable asset we have are meaningless. A nervous murmur went through the room. My uncle, a corporate lawyer himself, frowned, a look of deep concern on his face. He understood what I was implying. I turned my attention back to my father. Those are not just formalities, Dad. They are legally binding documents. And as the lead inventor, I have certain rights. For instance, I have the right to challenge any sale or transfer of intellectual property that I believe is not in the best interest of the science. I also have the right to withdraw my name from the FDA submission at any time before final approval. Carter's face went pale. What are you saying? He stammered. I am saying. I replied, my voice as cold and sharp as the ice in my glass, that this sale is not happening. Not unless I approve it. You seem to think you are selling a company. But what you are really selling is my work, and it is not for sale. Not on your terms. My father stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He thought I was bluffing. He thought I was a heartbroken girl throwing a tantrum trying to bargain for a piece of the pie. He had no idea I was not after the pie. I was the one who owned the entire recipe. My father laughed. It was a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the silent room. You would not dare, he sneered. You would not destroy your own career, this family's future, over some petty grievance. You are being childish. My voice remained steady, a cold counterpoint to his rising anger. This is not about a grievance. It is about the truth. And since we are talking about the truth, let us talk about the real inventor of this cure. I pointed to my mother's letter still lying on the table. What does that have to do with anything? Carter interjected, his voice tight with anxiety. Mom has been gone for years. Exactly, I said, turning to him. And for years, Dad has been telling the world that this company is her legacy. He has used her memory to build his brand, to secure investors to sell his story, but he left out the most important part. I held my father's gaze. I was not just a spectator. I was a witness. What are you implying? My father demanded, his voice dangerously low. I am not implying anything. I stated clearly. I am telling you. The final critical breakthrough, the key that unlocked the entire therapy, did not come from me. It came from her. It came from the research notes she wrote in the last few months of her life. The notes you have kept locked in your safe, calling them a memento, when in reality they were a stolen roadmap. A wave of shock rippled through the room. My aunts and uncles looked at my father, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning horror. They had all loved my mother. They had all believed his story of honoring her. "That is a lie," my father roared, his face turning a deep, dangerous red. "A desperate, vicious lie." "Is it?" I asked calmly. I reached into my pocket again and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen, and a holographic image of a document appeared in the air above it, a feature of a new secure app I had developed. It was a scanned page from my mother's journal. Her elegant handwriting was unmistakable, showing the exact molecular structure we were now calling the Vance cure. "I have the last 30 pages of her research, Dad, the ones you thought no one else had ever seen, the ones that prove scientifically and legally that you have built this entire $250 million empire on a lie." The projected image of my mother's handwriting hung in the air, a glowing testament to my father's deceit. The silence in the room was no longer just tense, it was suffocating. My father stared at the image, his face ashen. For the first time in his life, he was speechless. He had built his entire world on a narrative he controlled, and I had just demolished it with a single undeniable fact. Carter was the first to break his voice, a panicked whisper. "Turn it off, Julianne. Turn it off now." He looked wildly between me and my father, realizing the implications. He understood that this was not just about family drama anymore. This was about fraud. I ignored him. My focus was entirely on my father. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. His carefully constructed legacy was crumbling around him right here in the dining room where he had felt most powerful. "You built an empire on a lie," I repeated, my voice echoing slightly in the dead quiet. "You used her memory as a marketing tool while hiding her true contribution. You were going to sell her soul for $250 million. With my other hand, I composed a new email on my phone. My movements were precise, economical. The recipient was the CEO of the pharmaceutical corporation buying our company. The subject line was simple, urgent. Regarding intellectual property of the Vance cure. I attached the scanned images of my mother's research. I also CC'd the entire board of directors of Vance Medical Solutions and a senior editor at a leading biotech journal I knew personally. My finger hovered over the send button. "What are you doing?" My father finally choked out, his voice raspy. "I am correcting the record," I said. "I am making sure the world knows whose mind truly created this cure. I am making sure Eleanor Vance gets the credit she was denied." I looked at him one last time. "This is your final chance. Call off the sale. Publicly acknowledge Mom's contribution. Or I press this button and the world will know you not as a visionary CEO, but as a fraud who stole his own wife's legacy." His eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally and escape. But there were none. He was trapped by the truth. And then, 10 minutes after I had first spoken, his phone began to ring, a shrill, piercing sound that sealed his fate. He looked at the caller ID, and a new wave of horror washed over his face. It was the CEO of the acquiring company. The bomb had already gone off. It was the sound of $250 million vanishing into thin air. But to me, it was the sound of justice. My father stared at his ringing phone as if it were a venomous snake. The cheerful corporate ringtone was a macabre soundtrack to his ruin. He did not answer. He could not. What could he possibly say? The call went to voicemail, leaving an even more profound silence in its wake. The message was clear. The buyer knew. The board knew. The world was about to know. He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled not with anger anymore, but with a dawning, hollow despair. He had lost. He knew it. Every escape route was closed. Every lie had been exposed. "What do you want, Julianne?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The power in the room had shifted so completely it was almost a physical force. He was no longer the king in his castle. He was just an old man who had been caught. I did not want his money. I did not want his company. I wanted something far more valuable. "I want the truth," I said. "I want her name restored." I turned to address the rest of the room, my voice clear and unwavering. "The sale of Vance Medical Solutions is over. The company, as you know it, will likely be dismantled or restructured under board supervision. Your inheritance, the one you were celebrating 10 minutes ago, is gone." A few audible gasps and a low moan from one of my aunts filled the room. Carter sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. But the science remains, I continued. The cure is real, and it will not be bought or sold like a commodity. I will be forming a new independent research institute. It will be a non-profit foundation dedicated to advancing medical science, not shareholder profits. We will continue the work my mother's work, and we will make the therapy available at a reasonable cost. And the institute will have a name, I said, looking directly at my father delivering the final fatal blow. It will be called the Eleanor Vance Institute for Biomedical Research. Her name, not yours, will be the one associated with this cure forever. With that, I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I left them there in the wreckage of their Thanksgiving feast, surrounded by the ruins of an empire built on lies. They could keep the house. They could keep the name. I was taking the legacy. The days that followed Thanksgiving were a whirlwind of controlled chaos, but it was not my chaos. It was his. The fallout was swift and brutal. My email had acted like a detonator. The first public explosion came from the acquiring company. They issued a formal statement withdrawing their $250 million offer, citing unforeseen complications and serious ethical concerns regarding the intellectual property's true origin. They did not name names, but they did not have to. The message was clear. They were running from a scandal. The second explosion came from within. The board of directors of Vance Medical Solutions convened an emergency meeting. I was invited to attend via video conference not as a family member but as the legal owner of the core patents. I watched my face, a neutral mask on the large screen, as the people who had once praised my father's genius now scrambled to distance themselves from him. The evidence I presented was irrefutable. The company's entire valuation was built on research he had no legal or ethical right to claim as his own. He was not fired in a blaze of glory. It was much quieter, much more humiliating than that. The board issued a press release announcing Harrison Vance's immediate retirement for personal health reasons. They thanked him for his years of service in a statement so sterile and devoid of genuine praise that it was a condemnation in itself. He was stripped of his title, his office, his power, all in the space of 72 hours. He had spent a lifetime building a name for himself. Now that name was synonymous with fraud. The financial repercussions were just as devastating. With the sale collapsed and a cloud of scandal hanging over the company, the stock price of Vance Medical Solutions, which was publicly traded, plummeted. It lost 80% of its value in a single day. The family trusts the paper fortune my relatives had been celebrating just days before evaporated into almost nothing. The phone calls I received were a pathetic mix of angry accusations and desperate pleas, as if I could somehow reverse the consequences of my father's own actions. I did not answer. Their financial ruin was a side effect, not the goal. The goal was the truth, and the truth had a price. Harrison Vance, the man who understood money better than anyone, was finally learning that some debts can never be repaid. The company was in free fall, but the disintegration of my family was a much slower, more agonizing collapse. The foundation of our relationships had always been transactional, built on power money and my father's approval. With all three of those things gone, there was nothing left to hold us together. Carter was the first to turn. Faced with the reality that his cushy future had vanished, his loyalty to our father dissolved overnight. He called me a week after Thanksgiving, his voice a desperate, wheedling version of its former self. He blamed our father for everything. He knew Jules, he knew he was building on a shaky foundation, and he still pushed us all out on the ledge. He tried to position himself as another victim of our father's ambition, conveniently forgetting his own complicity, his own smug satisfaction at my disinheritance. He even had the audacity to suggest that he could help me run the new institute, bringing his financial acumen to my scientific vision. I cut him off. "Carter," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation, "the last time I trusted your financial acumen, you were celebrating the sale of stolen research. We have nothing further to discuss." The silence on the other end of the line was filled with a sputtering indignation. He was not used to being dismissed. I hung up before he could respond. That was the last time we spoke. The rest of the family fractured along predictable lines. Those who had benefited most from my father's reign were the quickest to condemn him, hoping to salvage their own reputations in the community. My uncle, the lawyer, sent me a carefully worded email expressing his profound disappointment in his brother's actions and his admiration for my courage. It was a transparent attempt to get back into my good graces now that I was the one holding the power. My father was left with nothing. His company was a shell, his fortune was gone, and his family had abandoned him. He was a king without a kingdom, a patriarch without a clan. I heard from a former colleague that he had become a recluse locked away in the grand house that now felt more like a mausoleum. He had spent his entire life in the public eye, obsessed with his legacy. Now his legacy was one of public disgrace. In the quiet of his empty office, surrounded by the awards and accolades that were now meaningless, he was finally alone with the one thing he could never sell or spin: the truth. 6 months after the Thanksgiving that dismantled an empire, I stood in a space that felt more like home than my childhood house ever had. It was a state-of-the-art laboratory, bright and clean, filled with the quiet hum of possibility. Sunlight streamed through massive windows, illuminating the gleaming chrome equipment and the focused faces of my team. This was the newly inaugurated Eleanor Vance Institute for Biomedical Research, my new beginning. The aftermath of my father's downfall had been messy, but it had also created an opportunity. When the story of his deception broke, it sent shockwaves through the scientific community. But alongside the condemnation for him, there was a groundswell of support for me and for my mother's true legacy. Donations began to pour in. First from private philanthropists who admired my stand, then from major foundations dedicated to ethical science, and even from former shareholders of Vance Medical Solutions who wanted to reinvest in the real science they had believed in all along. I did not have to seek out talent. They came to me. Brilliant scientists, renowned researchers, and bright young graduates from all over the world reached out. They were drawn not by the promise of stock options or corporate bonuses, but by the mission. They wanted to be part of something real, something driven by discovery, not by profit margins. I handpicked a team based not just on their credentials, but on their character. They were people who, like me, believed that science had a higher purpose. We were not a company. We were a collective, a family chosen not by blood, but by a shared passion for the truth. Our coffee breaks were filled with lively debates about cellular biology, not gossip about corporate politics. Our successes were celebrated as a team with every member's contribution valued and acknowledged. There was no hierarchy of ego, only a collaborative pursuit of knowledge. I looked around at the faces of my team, men and women of all ages and backgrounds, united in their purpose. They were my new family, a family built on mutual respect, intellectual honesty, and a shared dream. Here in this building bearing my mother's name, we were not just conducting experiments. We were building a future where science served humanity and where the truth was the most valuable asset of all. The final piece of the past arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. A legal courier delivered a heavy climate-controlled case to my new office at the Institute. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were my mother's original research journals. After months of legal wrangling, the board of the now-defunct Vance Medical Solutions had been compelled by a court order to release them to me, her sole intellectual heir. They were no longer a corporate asset. They were mine. That evening, long after the last researcher had gone home, I sat alone in the silent lab. The only light came from the soft glow of my desk lamp illuminating the worn leather covers of the journals. For a moment, I just looked at them, my heart a strange mix of sorrow and triumph. This was what it had all been about. Not the money, not the revenge, but this. These books, this legacy. With a deep breath, I opened the first journal. Her handwriting so familiar and yet so distant filled the pages. It was like hearing her voice again after a long, painful silence. I read for hours, tracing the evolution of her thoughts, the brilliant leaps of logic, the frustrating dead ends, and the sudden exhilarating breakthroughs. This was her mind, her passion, her soul captured in ink on paper. I finally reached the last 30 pages, the ones I had copied in secret all those years ago. Reading them now in their original form felt different. It was not just data anymore, it was a conversation. I could feel her excitement, her urgency as she got closer to the answer. I saw the question marks she scribbled in the margins the way she underlined certain equations 3 times. It was a race against time, a final desperate push to solve the puzzle before her own body failed her. When I read the very last entry, a single sentence at the bottom of the final page, the tears I had held back for months finally came. The entry was not an equation or a chemical formula. It was a note written to herself, or perhaps to me. "I think this is it," she had written. "I hope this can help someone someday." In that moment, all the anger I had carried for my father simply dissolved. It did not matter anymore. He had tried to own her legacy, but he had never truly understood it. Her legacy was not a product to be sold. It was a gift to be shared. Holding her journals in the institute that bore her name, surrounded by the science she had started, I felt a profound sense of peace. The command from her letter was fulfilled. Her truth was safe. Her legacy was not locked in a safe anymore. It was alive. It was in my hands, in every test tube, in every microscope, in every hope for a cure. A year has passed since that Thanksgiving. Today, the Eleanor Vance Institute is thriving. Just last month, we published our first major paper detailing a significant advancement in the therapy based directly on my mother's foundational work. The scientific community has embraced our collaborative nonprofit model. We are proving every day that it is possible to pursue groundbreaking science with integrity to prioritize patients over patents. My office overlooks the main laboratory. On my wall, there is only one framed picture. It is a photo of my mother taken years ago at her own lab bench. She is not posing for the camera, but looking down at a microscope, a small, focused smile on her face. It is not the picture of a victim or a martyr, the image my father tried to sell to the world. It is the picture of a scientist in her element, absorbed in the work she loved. It is the truest image of her. I no longer think about the $250 million. I no longer think about the company that bears my family's name. The anger and the pain have faded, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. My father's actions forced me to choose between the family I was born into and the legacy I was meant to protect. I chose the legacy, and in doing so, I found a new family, a new home, and a new understanding of what success really means. The cure my mother envisioned is closer than ever to becoming a reality. Not as a product that will make a few people rich, but as a gift that will help countless others live. Her name will not be remembered on a corporate letterhead, but in the grateful hearts of the people her work will save. The empty chair at the Thanksgiving table is no longer a symbol of loss. It is a symbol of a promise kept, of a truth restored. It is a symbol of hope. For anyone watching this who has ever felt their voice silenced, their contributions erased, or their worth defined by someone else, I hope my story serves as a reminder. A true legacy is not what you own or control. It is the truth you are willing to fight for. Have you ever had to fight for your own truth in your family or your career? Share your story in the comments below, because every one of those stories deserves to be heard. If this resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice. Remember, your voice matters, your work matters, and the truth you carry is the most powerful asset you will ever have. Thank you for listening.